The select we are back in session. Parties and council are present. All members of our jury and our alternates are present. And our witness is back on the witness stand. You may continue your examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. So when we left off, I was asking about the results of the University of Tennessee body harm study.
Yes.
And the results indicated to them that human nuclear DNA from cadavers was largely unrecoverable from the soil throughout the decomposition stage.
They did state that they were able to recover nuclear DNA, and they tested one single locus, not multiple locations, but at that one locus they looked at, they were able to get results out of 5 out of the 45 samples, but 18 of the 45 showed inhibition, meaning, and I discussed inhibition briefly, that affects the amplification process, or how well the sample amplifies. So they were seeing 40% of the samples that were inhibited because of the soil, likely, and so those were not getting results. We don't really know if DNA was present in those or not, basically.
So the question again wasn't the result, the conclusion of their study, that nuclear DNA from cadavers is largely unrecoverable?
Yes, 5 out of 45, yes.
And so we have blood degrades quickly over a 90-day period of time.
Yes, that's what that study was showing, that they were able to get results, but it was showing degradation.
And can't really get human nuclear DNA from soil underneath cadavers.
It's going to depend upon the soil as well as the temperature. We're also able to get, in the same study, they talk about DNA can persist in soil for thousands of generations, and that they're getting results from Neanderthal DNA in soil. But some were in very cold environments or in cave environments. So it can persist. It's going to depend upon the environment, the soil, the type of soil, exposure to water, things like that.
So they talked about it, but they still, in their study, they couldn't recover it.
They did recover some nuclear DNA in 5 out of 45 samples. They recovered nuclear DNA at one location that they looked at, and 40% of the samples were inhibited, where they don't know if there's DNA or not.
You said that earlier we were talking about the results from voting, and you said, and I quote, we have results in this case. All that testimony from earlier.
Yes, there were some samples where partial profiles were developed at voting.
Some samples where partial profiles were developed. And we discussed some of the various locations. One location had 4 out
Yes.
of the 22.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. You got those results from voting, right?
I did.
And you made the decision to refer it to cybergenetics.
That wasn't. Oh, I referred. Yes, I said it's possible that this company would be able to help you out to look at that lower level data. Yes.
And they use what's called probabilistic genotyping.
Yes.
And a product that's similar to STR mix.
It has some similarities and has some differences. Yes.
What are the differences?
Star Mix, I don't believe that they will take data from other laboratories. I think they did it in one case, and then they haven't since. So that is a system that usually has to be validated at the individual laboratory that's performing the DNA testing. And they also use an analytical threshold that is defined by the laboratory.
Defined by their laboratory.
Defined by the individual laboratory that's doing the Star Mix testing, yes.
So the individual laboratory that has Star Mix, they define the analytical threshold.
They do.
Well, cybergenetics sets an analytical threshold.
I don't know. I don't work for them. I don't know how they do their testing.
You had some questions, though, just last year about the use of probabilistic genotyping.
I did.
And in fact, you're quoted in an article as saying you haven't made up your mind about it.
At that point, yes, I had not reviewed enough validation studies, enough literature. It was relatively new. in the community, and there were definitely some questions about, is it, a valid procedure or not? So sure.
So sometime between June of last year and December of last year, so you referred those samples or the electronic data to cybergenetics, right?
Yes, I told the attorneys, hey, you can use this company. That was it. I'm not promoting them. They're going to be here to testify about their results. I don't work for them. I've never used Trulial.
So you never used it, you know nothing about it, but you thought, hey, maybe they can get some better results.
I didn't say, I do know something about it. I try to read and understand it, but again, I've not been trained on the use of probabilistic genotyping. So there's a limit to what I would be willing to testify about and talk about because it's not part of my training.
Okay, that's fair. But in any event, you said, hey, they might be able to get you different results.
Yes, because I had certainly attended conferences and presentations put on by cybergenetics as well as the manufacturers of StarMix. And yes, I thought that perhaps knowing what I know about probabilistic genotyping, that this company may be able to assist.
And that was after you reviewed the data from Bodie.
Yes.
And then did you also review the data from cybergenetics at some point? I know you're not fresh on it.
Right, I looked at it briefly. It's a very thick packet of information that I was able to understand some of it, but not all of it, frankly.
Coordinator team brief sidebar?
I'm sorry,
Would coordinator team a brief sidebar?
with regard to her going into the cybergenetics?
Yes.
No.
For the vote?
Bodie, with regard, so
Same.
long as it's in line with the guidelines previously discussed.
I think we already got it. Okay, so you don't know how it works, but you said, hey, let's try these. Maybe you should try these folks out. They can get you better results or different results. Right?
I mean, in essence, I suppose, like I said, I've not been trained on it. I do have some understanding of probabilistic genotyping, but not to the point where I would feel comfortable testifying about it because it's not part of my training.
We talked about, I'm going to back up a little bit. Sorry for jumping around. You talked a little bit about, we were talking about bodies, whether they're buried or on top of the soil. You talked about environmental factors.
Sure.
And at least one of these items that you tested was actually found outside the array.
Right, one of the bra cups, is my understanding.
The right cup. How does that, as a DNA analyst, that affects your interpretation, right? Or at least what you expect to get from that?
It can have an impact on expectations per se. Yeah, I mean, things that are exposed to the elements, the DNA can certainly degrade more quickly. I don't know exactly how this was, if it was, right out in the bright sunshine, if it was, I think I recall reading that it was kind of snagged on a bush or something like that. I could be wrong. So perhaps it was protected in some manner, but certainly exposed to elements is not ideal for DNA.
And anybody could walk by and touch it, pick it up.
That's true, yes.
If a full-grown adult female decomposes on top of an article of clothing as DNA evidence, performing the DNA analysis, whose DNA would you expect to find?
Objection as to improper hypothetical not supported by the evidence.
Overruled, so she has an opinion.
So in this hypothetical, the clothing is on the female, underneath the female? Underneath. So yeah, when the person decomposes, as those soil studies suggest, their DNA can leach into the surrounding environment. So it would be certainly possible to get DNA from an item of evidence that was underneath an individual who decomposed. Decomposition fluid does have an impact on our ability to get results. It can be From my experience, you pick up inhibitors as well, and sometimes you cannot get a result from that.
Again, my question was, whose DNA would you expect to find?
If you're going to get a result from clothing, you could find certainly the person who decomposed.
So a result that said that that person was excluded would be odd.
If it were directly under the particular individual, then it might be surprising, yeah.
Be weird, right? Be a weird result.
Again, there can be inhibitors in play, but yeah, when you have a large amount of someone's DNA, then there can be an expectation to see their DNA.
So any DNA as a DNA analyst that you would expect to find, you would at least expect to find that person's DNA, right? The person who's decomposing on top of the DNA.
You could have that expectation, yes.
And if the person was wrapped in something, or something was wrapped around that person as they decompose, same expectation?
Potentially, if it was plastic, perhaps not like the outer surface of the plastic, maybe not. I mean,
Tie-down strap?
if it were in contact with the body, perhaps.
Well, let's say it was in contact with a material that would soak up fluid. Wouldn't there be some touch DNA between the material and the, for instance, I'm using a hypothetical tie-down strap. Would there be some contact between the two of them?
I would expect there to be contact with the cloth or whatever the tie-down strap was tied down to. Whether the decomposition fluid leached through to that, I don't know. It would be possible.
Just a few final questions.
Okay.
Can I see, what exhibit is that? What exhibit is that?
1,000. You recognize that?
I do.
Is that in the real list of your DNA profile? That's your DNA profile.
It is.
So, a lot of the items that came out of the grave didn't have any reportable DNA results on them, right?
From Bodie, correct.
Or even from San Bernardino.
Oh, sure. And from San Bernardino, yes.
So, two agencies looked and said, a lot of this stuff, we can't find any DNA. In fact, the majority of this stuff, we can't find any DNA.
Well, the Bodie testing about, again, we talked about the number of samples, and there were actually 2 samples that I'm kind of excluding from that list. So I'd said 9 before, really it's 4 of 8. So 50% of the samples showed some DNA
Okay.
at Bodie.
But a lot of the samples from San Bernardino that came from the grave didn't have any DNA.
Right.
Can you say to any degree of certainty whatsoever that the results found by Bodie are representative of what was on those items when they were put into the grave?
No, I mean, I can say it is representative of the DNA that was collected with the MVAC. When it was applied, I can't say with certainty.
So you can't say it's representative of what was on those items when they were buried for 3 years in their initial grave.
No, not with any certainty, no.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Anything I believe we're at?
Couple questions.
Now, the cross-examination started yesterday, Thursday, with the fact that you advertise a private business.
Yes.
Are you paid by the government to just get paid for showing up to work?
No, well, I mean, some of the contracts I have are through government agencies, but it's not, I'm paid by the hour to do a specific number of hours I'm approved for that case.
All the money you make is by contracts with clients you obtain through some type of contact or advertising.
Yes.
Now, do you remember first contacting or having contact with me?
Yes.
Did I call your office? You know, I'm glad what I saw on your website. It looks awesome. You can tear apart their DNA.
No, I didn't even have that same website up at the time.
Where did we meet?
I was a vendor in Monterey at a capital defense seminar. So basically, they'll have seminars for attorneys, and then they have vendors, people who are selling a product, for lack of a different term. Mine was DNA consulting. They might have other DNA labs. It's not all forensic related either. It would be anything that might be able to assist an attorney that is representing a client.
And so there's scores of vendors there generally at those conferences. Would that be fair to say?
There are usually a lot, yeah.
It's usually between classes or break, everybody comes out and meets everybody.
Right. Put chocolate out, try to draw them in,
Bail bondsmen don't give away always the best prizes, right?
Yeah.
Now, one of the things they brought up is that you will teach us how to mitigate a DNA match. Could you help us try and mitigate a DNA match here?
No, there wasn't, from the Bodie results, they're basically inconclusive. There's not a match to any particular individual.
And actually, the testimony of the people's expert, you agree with the final conclusion that he made on the touch DNA from the Zuzu Trooper, correct?
I do, yes.
Now, there was discussion about that touch DNA to where you were making assumptions that a handshake happened. You remember that part of the questioning?
I do.
Now, touch DNA just does not come from a handshake, correct?
It does. You're correct.
It can be from Mr. Merritt touching the table and me coming by and touching the same part of the table.
Yes, it can.
Me grabbing a pin that Mr. Merritt's writing with.
Yes.
Me taking my cell phone. It's an expert. Me taking my cell phone and handing it to Merritt. Look at this on my phone, and he holds my phone and I take it back. Can DNA transfer that way?
Yes, it can.
If we're walking outside that door and we both walk up to the handle and I go out first and I put my hand on the door and walk out and the Merritt grabs the handle in the same location, do you have a transfer there?
It can. Not always, but yeah, it can.
Touch transfer does not just have one way of transfer, correct?
Not at all.
In the studies try and show the different ways it can happen?
Yes. Yeah, it discusses, what we call person-to-person transfer. That would be the direct contact, the handshake, the hug, something like that. But it also can transfer person to object to person. And it's not just what we call secondary transfer. Secondary is basically one step removed. We now have studies showing tertiary transfer and quaternary transfer. So it can and does occur. It occurs in journal articles. It occurs in the lab. Even when we try to prevent that, we're wearing lab coats and gloves and cleaning things down. Sometimes it happens in a laboratory setting.
They can't, in the studies, they can't always identify how the transfer happened. They can just see it happen.
Sometimes, yes.
Now, the items that were selected by the defense team to send for first NVAC testing, because we had a list of all the items that came from the grave, correct?
Correct.
And then we had to sit down and decide, well, which ones are we going to bring out for you to test?
Right.
Now, of course, if money was no object, since it's $900 a test, we could have just tested 200 items, right?
That's an argument of sustained on relevancy grounds and evidence coefficient too.
Now, you talked about on direct that you work a lot with cold case investigations.
Correct.
And you consulted as a DA consultant on law enforcement cold case investigation.
I have.
Would it be fair to say that your experience in developing DNA information for cold case law enforcement investigations was the basis for help you decide which items you might be most efficient in testing?
Yes.
Or should I say cost efficient?
Yes, and most likely to obtain results if we were going to obtain any results.
One of the items that was asked of you was about A20, the DNA swab from underneath, I think it was Joseph McStay's fingernail.
Okay,
Do you remember that line of questioning?
I do, yes.
And I think you said there was low-level male DNA recovered?
Yes, for the quantitation stage. So again, recall that there's a step after extraction that you quantitate. You determine, is there any DNA present, either human DNA or male DNA?
So DNA survived?
Yes,
Wow. And then you corrected that it's 4 of 8 items, correct?
yes.
Because there was a 5th item, number 9, that we also excluded, correct? Which I believe was item from the Bodie one, the EO7.
Correct, yes. EO7 was excluded as well as E10.
And those were excluded because they were not collected in the same circumstance as the other 8. Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
Now the body farm study. Relating the body farm study to this case, is that a fair analogy?
I would say no, and that frankly I didn't really focus a lot of my time on that paper just because it's talking about the body itself decomposing and can you get DNA from the body itself. It's not discussing touch or trace or transfer DNA.
And it's also has the problem of soil inhibitors.
Right, well that can occur in any sample that's been buried. Inhibitors are known to be present in certain soil types.
And explain to the jury what happens when there's a soil inhibitor in the soil.
So when you have an inhibitor, you typically at the quantitation stage, it tells you basically at that stage, there's a separate control that tells you if you have an inhibitor. So you know right then, and it'll show no DNA detected, but you know that that's not an accurate or reliable result because of that inhibitor. You're not getting, you don't know if there's any DNA. So then when you go to amplify, to do that copying process, sometimes the kits that we're using can overcome the inhibitors and you get maybe a partial profile. Sometimes they can't and you get no result at all. So basically when you have an inhibitor, you're not sure whether you have DNA in the extract or not.
Now, DNA is commonly recovered from bones that are buried for extended periods of time. Would that be fair to say?
They can be, yes.
Do the bones protect the DNA itself?
Right, so that's why, one of the reasons we think we can get DNA from bones is that the matrix of the bones the DNA absorbs to the matrix of the bones and it's protected then. So we have to do a number of steps to try to get that DNA released into the extract, but what that means is that we can oftentimes get results from bones that are very old.
I saw the story where King Richard III or something was found under a parking lot centuries later.
Right.
And it was DNA from the bone.
Yes.
Now, does soil ever act as a binding agent to help protect DNA as well?
That is what the Emmons study that we've been talking about says, that it can basically act in the same manner, that the DNA actually adsorbs to the soil and it can protect it from what we call DNases. Those are enzymes that will break down DNA.
And what type of soil did they say was the best for that?
Sandy soil.
like the soil in the desert.
Objection since facts not evidence.
Well, who else can answer? She has an opinion.
And I would actually, just to clarify, that was the other study, the study with the blood in the soil. They tested marshy soil, clay soil, and sandy soil, and found the sandy soil gave the best results.
And there was the one study that talked about the 90-day limit. That was about touch DNA, correct?
It was blood.
That was blood?
But,
Okay.
and again, they tested out to 90 days. Had they tested further, they might still be getting profiles or partial profiles. We just don't know.
So the limit wasn't, it can't go past 90 days, that's as far as we look.
That's as far as they looked, yes.
It's like saying there's only 3 planets because we only looked out to Mars. And then when you look further, there could be more, right?
Sure.
Now, you made the recommendation that we send our Bodie data, Bodie digital data to cybergenetics, correct?
Yeah, I made that suggestion, yes.
And the terms that were used by counsel in questioning was we get different results, better results. That's not what we were doing, was it?
It was the same result. So it was the electronic DNA data produced by Bodie Cellmark. It was a different way of interpreting the results. It was not relying on manual interpretation methods. It was relying on this probabilistic genotyping software.
And so, from a standpoint of protocols and guidelines, manual or human interpretation of DNA has certain protocols or guidelines they must follow, correct?
Sure.
And so if Bodie did their test and gave us results, are you allowed under the guidelines to give a different opinion than what they reached? Or can you follow different guidelines than the ones they follow?
I personally would not. I would want, because there could be differences in interpretation of mixtures or something like that, but the data that's actually reported and callable, meaning meets their guidelines, they're the ones that perform the validations on these particular instruments and this particular kit. I can't go in and say, no, you should have used an analytical threshold of 25 for this when you're using 150. They're basing it upon their validation. I can't change that validation.
So there's no way you can say, ignore what they say, let's lower the analytical threshold and I'll tell you what I see. That's not what you could do.
I would not do that, no.
But in the protocols that were written by, or under the guidance of the FBI, I believe is who wrote them, correct? All protocols for the nationwide.
No.
Okay, who gives the guidance on the protocols written?
Labs are audited and accredited against the FBI's quality assurance standards, but the FBI doesn't say this is what your procedure must be. And then there are guidelines that are recommended by SWGDAM, SWGDAM, that's the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods. So they are a body that says, okay, this is what we think is best practice, here's what you should be looking at. You need to have an analytical threshold, you need to have a stochastic threshold, and gives guidance, but it's not, labs are not accredited to those particular guidelines or suggestions at this time.
Is it true that part of your recommendation came on the fact that probabilistic genotyping follows different guidelines? Or the same guidelines with a different analysis approach?
Yeah, so it's a very different approach, and it is something that's recommended by SWGDAM, the same group. They don't say that labs should use probabilistic genotyping. They say if you validate it, this is an accepted way. This is a way that labs should be looking at how they should be interpreting their mixtures, because because of touch DNA, transfer DNA, labs are getting more and more low-level mixed samples that are very difficult to interpret with the normal manual methods. In the past, we had a mixture, it was usually two people. You know, you might have a rape case and you have the male fraction and the male DNA and the female DNA. Those are pretty easy to separate out. But when you have 3 and 4 or more contributors, you need different guidelines. And again, probabilistic genotyping is something that SWIG-DAN suggests as a possible alternative to interpreting mixtures.
Is it fair to summarize that when you recommended sending information to cybergenetics, you said that there's data in the results that cybergenetics may be able to work with?
Yes.
And it was more of a, let's send it to them and see what results or what conclusions they can reach.
Right.
Did we know what they were going to say?
No.
It was just kind of a, I guess, a crapshoot. Just close our eyes, throw a dart, and see if it hits the board and see what happens.
I mean, I knew that there was DNA, what appeared to me to be true DNA data. It was below the lab's analytical threshold, so it wasn't all being reported. But based upon my knowledge and experience, it looked like real DNA types. And so the only way to interpret those lower level types is with probabilistic genotyping.
And lastly, there was talking about items that were tested by San Bernardino crime lab for DNA. Again, they used a different type of method of collection and processing. Right?
They did, exactly. They used the swabbing method, the more traditional method, which is going to be a smaller area and not necessarily as effective as the MVAC of picking up DNA.
Now, you do processing, sampling, and also analysis in the Pure Gold lab, correct?
Yes, and pure gold forensics, yes.
Now, if you're doing work and you get some kind of results, is there generally protocols to look for or eliminate any contamination by the actual lab technician?
Yes,
And that is done, assuming in all labs that do DNA testing?
they should be,
Yes.
yes.
I was going to say, our better question is, should they be?
They should be, yes.
And the results that were obtained in not only Bodie analysis, but in cybergenetics analysis and conclusion, those results, if they gave profiles, could begin compared back to the personnel that touched at the sheriff's department to eliminate any contaminations from them. Correct?
It could be, yes.
So if there's complaints that it's contaminated, that should be able to be eliminated if they know the personnel that worked on everything.
Right, if they know the personnel, which I'm sure they do, and have their DNA profiles, those profiles could be compared.
And if they don't rule out contamination by their people, does that leave any objection suspect in your mind as to claiming it's contaminated?
I'm sorry, does that leave any what?
If they're saying, well, this could be contaminated, this can be contaminated, but if you don't check, is that proper scientific method?
If you know who has handled a particular item or come into contact with it, then there should be, a pretty easy way to then double check and make sure that person's DNA is not on the item of evidence.
Now, one of the items that was shown to you, I think they left it here with me, was the validation validation study for the MVAC that was done by San Bernardino County, correct?
Yes.
And so does that mean to say that San Bernardino County owns an MVAC?
Yes. I mean, that's how I take it. Whether they still have it or not, I don't know. At one point, they had one, yes.
Is there any evidence presented to you that they actually used it in this case?
No, they did not.
And probabilistic genotyping, your understanding is that it's used by law enforcement?
It's used by crime laboratories.
And by crime labs, you mean public crime or public labs?
Public labs, some private labs, yes.
And we heard testimony before that the star mix, STRMIX,
Yes.
I believe it was Don Jones that testified San Bernardino has star mix. Did you see
I
that
bel-
part of the testimony?
Yes, so I think at the time he did the testing, they didn't have it, but they currently do have that, yes.
Have you seen or been provided any reports or anything to show that the government decided to test our digital data in their star mix?
Not anything that I've been provided, no.
So they're avoiding, for argument's
Objection,
sake.
speculation, argumentative.
Sustained,
Move to strike that.
sustained the last questions.
And lastly, in the consulting phase, when you were asking on cross, if you, the consulting firm you mostly do with defense attorneys.
Right.
And why is that?
The reason for that is that if the prosecution has a question or needs someone to testify about the results, they're going to go to the analyst who actually did the testing. I mean, that's when I worked for the Department of Law Enforcement in Florida. That's, you know, I testified probably 40 times just at FDLE alone for the prosecution because I was the one doing the testing. So as a consultant, it doesn't mean I couldn't, and there have been prosecutors that have reached out to me to review data. It's a small percentage, but mostly it's defense attorneys because they don't, sometimes they have a good working relationship with the laboratory, but not always. There's sometimes the lab people are told, not to speak with, and I'm not saying that happened here, I don't know, but sometimes they're not to talk with the defense attorneys. And so if they have questions, they need someone to ask those questions to. And so that's why defense consultants exist, basically.
Sometimes we could ask stupid questions.
Occasionally.
I had more than one of those, would you care to say?
No objection.
Oh, no objection. Sorry, I thought he objected. Yes, there were several. No.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Anything else?
Yes, you said you got some results from voting. It was not a match. That's what you just said. Right?
So they did not make any matches.
Did you just testify that you got results, but it was not a match?
No, I believe I said they did not make any matches. The data was inconclusive.
But they got results, but not a match. You didn't just testify to that.
They did not make any matches to anybody. It was inconclusive.
That's what I just did you just say that they got results, but not a match? Did you or did you not just say that?
Objection, asked and answered.
Sustained.
Did you compare those results to Mr. Merrick's profile? Ones you got from voting?
I did look, but you can't use the data because it's below the analytical threshold. I mean,
Did you look at the ones that were reported that were above the analytical threshold?
I probably did, yes.
That'd probably be important to do, right?
I mean, I looked at the data, yes.
Okay, so you looked at the results from Bodie that were reported and they were above the analytical threshold, right?
Yes, sure.
And did you compare those to Mr. Merritt's known results?
If I did, it's not something I would testify about because it's not based upon their guidelines. Their guidelines are stating these results are partial, that they're not useful for comparison purposes.
But they reported certain alleles at certain locations, right?
Yes.
And some of those alleles at some locations match Mr. Merritt.
Objection, Your Honor, now goes beyond scope.
Sustained.
How many law enforcement agencies use Truly?
I don't know.
Objection, foundation.
Overrule the answer, I don't know, Rick, you mean,
Well, Mr. McGee just asked you, law enforcement agencies use it, right? And you said, oh, yes.
Objection, misstates the testimony.
overrule.
I believe he was referring to probabilistic genotyping in general. I know that Kern County uses TrueAllele. Georgia Bureau of Investigation, I believe, uses TrueAllele. I don't have a list in front of me. There are more that use StarMix. I would say that in my experience of reviewing cases.
And you weren't, in this case, you weren't trying to mitigate a match of DNA, right?
I wasn't trying to what?
Mitigate a match of DNA?
Mitigate a match of DNA.
Right, that's what your seminar was billed as, right?
Well, there wasn't any reported results that included or excluded anybody. I mean, there's results, but if you look at the report, they're saying there's partial profiles and that due to the limited data, no conclusions can be made.
Well, but you said you compared them to Mr. Merritt's profile, right?
I'm sure that I did look at the data to do a comparison, but that's not something that I would come in here and testify about because they're low-level mixtures of DNA. I don't know what's dropping out, what's present, what's not, and again, that's why I suggested probabilistic genotyping that's able to take into account all of that information.
And you reviewed the results from cytogenetics at some point, right?
I did look over the results, yes.
Did you compare them to your own STR DNA profile?
I did, yes.
And?
I was excluded.
How do you know that?
Well, I will tell you, I looked at the profiles that they wanted to have entered into CODIS as keyword searches. Those were the ones that they were able to pull out. And so I looked at all of the DNA types, which were really big mixtures of DNA, and compared my profile, and at those particular profiles, there were exclusions. There's some DNA types that are going to be similar because that's just how it goes.
1007.
Okay,
Are the highlighted ones consistent with your review?
I would have to stop and look because it's going to take a couple minutes. Well, there's no 25 here, so I would be excluded there.
Okay.
So no, it's not consistent.
Okay. So there's one area where you're.
Well, there might be more. I can look. I had this, and yeah, I know that I looked at these because this was definitely something I wanted to know.
This is 1007, right? That's not a single profile.
Well, it's a mixture. Yeah, absolutely.
Mixture of at least how many people?
Well, there's 22 alleles reported here,
Yeah.
so it's, I guess, 11.
Mixture of 11 people.
If this is all real data, you're gonna have to ask TrueAllele about these results.
I'll ask Truly. What
Okay.
you're saying is you're not included on there on these highlighted.
I'm not, right?
Okay. But you can't explain what the chart means. Right?
Sustained.
Can you explain what the chart means?
It's a list of DNA types that TrueAllele, through their probabilistic genotyping, recognized as possible alleles in the data. And so I did go through and make a comparison to see if my DNA was present, because like we just said, with that one particular sample, there could be up to 11 people present. So looking at that, even with all of those possible DNA types, I was not included as a contributor.
On that one,
On what one?
on the one I showed you.
On the DNA type, those were the ones that they wanted to upload to the database for a keyword search. Right.
How do you upload it when it's not even a single person? It's 11 different people.
You can do that with probabilistic genotyping. There are labs, San Diego Sheriff's Office, or excuse me, San Diego Police Department routinely uploads multiple complex mixtures to from probabilistic genotyping to the database.
CODIS?
Yes.
Make sure there's 11 different people.
I don't know if 11, no. It has to meet a match criteria, or a rareness. The profile has to be rare enough to be able to upload it.
So when you're asked how many people use true allele, and yes, it's used for probabilistic genotyping in general, you don't really know how many people use true allele, how many agencies use true allele.
I don't have a specific number. It is becoming more and more common for both true allele and star mix to be used in crime laboratories.
And you won't really go beyond what Bodie's results were, other than to say there might be something there, let's send it out to somewhere else. And that's because Bodie establishes an analytical threshold based on their instrumentation.
Yes.
Right? So they run their validation studies and they know where interference is, where the grass is, on the EPG, things of that nature. All those stochastic effects, they know based on their particular instrument.
Right, for manual interpretation, yes.
For manual interpretation. Thank you.
Anything else?
Yep.
Mr. McKay?
Just one question. The exhibit 101 that he showed you with along each, what you were looking at, because the jury hadn't seen it, is all the loci listed down, correct?
Correct.
With the, it seems to be identified markers, different markers across. That'd be fair to say?
Different DNA types, yes.
And that's not saying how many contributors there were to it, is it? It's just saying these are numbers that went into the calculation.
Well, you can look at the number of DNA types that are in a profile to get an estimation of the number of potential contributors. So that's why I said, if those are all real, true DNA types, if they're going out to 22, that means at least 11 contributors, if that's what that data is saying.
And you're not giving an opinion of what the data says.
No.
So it should not be attributed to you as how many people contributed to a mixture analyzed by Trulia.
No.
And any inference to that would be in the misstatement of your testimony, would that be correct?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not my data. It's not, again, I do not want to testify to cybergenetics results or how they do their interpretation of what those types mean or are. That's not my area of expertise.
You understand the concept, right?
Yes.
But we can hear from the horse's mouth. As they say.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Nothing further.
Anything else?
No. So, Your Honor, thank you.
Any objection to Ms. Ryan being excused?
Subject to recall, please.
Sure. Thank you for your attendance, and you are excused, subject to recall.
Okay.
I assume they know where to find you if we need anything additional
Yes.
from you.
Yep.
All right. I'm guessing you don't have your next witness here?
No, Your Honor.
We'll go ahead and take our evening recess at this time until 9:30 tomorrow morning. Keep in mind the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case, and we'll see everyone back 9:30 tomorrow morning.